Hello class, this screencast highlights some of the points mentioned in Chapter 5, which is about binding theory, in which the noun phrase is discussed semantically and syntactically. We will start with the semantic types of noun phrases. If you hear a sentence like John did great in syntax, the speaker is assuming that you know John, and that John is a person who's taken syntax class. On that John, he just recently passed midterm, final exam, and in which he did well. So these two noun phrases referring to entities in the words, to object in the words, that's what they get their meaning from. And that's what we call the referring expressions or R expressions, in which the noun phrase gets its meaning by referring to entities in the word. And it can be proper noun, common noun, or pronoun, etc. These two noun phrases are not connected, which is the opposite of the second sentence here. If you look to this sentence, John saw himself in the mirror. We have the first noun phrase John, the second noun phrase in the sentence himself. Himself cannot stand by itself. It has to have another noun in the sentence, another word in the sentence to get its meaning from. So these two noun phrases are connected. They are bound in a relation. And we call this noun phrase himself anaphor. With the anaphor, it has and it must. It's obligatory relationship. It has to have another noun phrase in the sentence in which it gets meaning from. The third type of the semantic noun phrases is the pronoun. The case is different. The pronoun sometimes might get the meaning from another word in the sentence, other times might not. So let us see the first sentence. Jordan said that he played tennis. So we have Jordan, the first noun phrase. We have he, the pronoun, the second noun phrase. These two noun phrases are referring to the same person. So the pronoun gets its meaning from another word in the sentence. However, the second meaning of this sentence, Jordan said that he played tennis. And here the semantic relation is different. So probably Jordan tells us about someone else. That person loved to play tennis, and that person played tennis. So here the pronoun refers to someone else outside the structure of the sentence. If you notice also, with their R expressions, the anaphor and the pronoun, they come in a specific position in the sentence. So the structure of the sentence, it has to be guided and structured well in order for us to get the meaning of these noun phrases. And that has to do with the syntactic relations of the noun phrases. So with the syntactic relation of noun phrase, let us have this sentence. Himself saw John in the mirror. We have the first noun phrase himself, which is anaphor as we know. And we call it sometimes bindee, that means bound by another noun phrase. This sentence is not grammatical because the bindee most often has to follow the binder. So John here the binder, and we will call it antecedent as we will see in another slide. So John is commanding himself. John is related to himself and is not always the anaphor follow the precedent or the antecedent noun phrase, but it's the most frequent case. this relation called binding theory, which refers to the structural relations that we learned from previous chapters. Before we dive deep to binding theory, let us have another terminology that we will use in this chapter. So the second idea that I would like to mention is the coindex and the antecedent. And with these two terminology, let us have this example to make the idea clear. John saw himself in the mirror. So we know John is the binder, or is the first noun phrase in the sentence. We call it antecedent. And anaphor, himself, as we just explained. And this is the bindee. These two noun phrases have the same indexes here, the subscript letter called index. So these two indexes are the same, and we call these two noun phrases co-indexed. They co-refer to the same meaning, to the same person. So this is basically the co-index and the antecedent. Now let us see what's the binding and what's going on with the binding. Let's have John saw himself in the mirror again, this example. So we know this is the first noun phrase, the binder, himself, the anaphor, the second noun phrase in the sentence. So if we look to these subscript letters are the same. That means these two noun phrases are referring to the same person and they are bound and these successful binding relations. With the second sentence, we have the subject as two noun phrases embedded, John's and father. So this subject is the first noun phrase in the sentence. Himself, anaphor, is the second noun phrase in the sentence. If we look to the subscript letters, this himself anaphor is bound and connected to the whole subject phrase, which is consisted of two noun phrases inside. And that's why the binding is successful in this example as well. However, the third sentence, John's father, it's an grammatical sentence because the anaphor here refers and are connected, co-indexed with the noun phrase inside the subject structure. So in order for the binding relation to work, the anaphor, or this second noun phrase, it has to be connected, bound by the whole noun phrase structure, not by another noun phrase embedded inside this subject noun phrase structure. So with the binding, hopefully the tree will make it more clear. So we have John, and John is the noun phrase, and the verb phrase saw, and the other noun phrase himself, the anaphor, and we have prepositions, the rest of the sentence. So if you see that John is a C commanding noun phrase, and as you know from the previous chapter, for the C command to work, the A, which is the noun phrase here, must be commanding the second noun phrase in the sentence without another noun or another object interfere between them. That means there is no other subject or no other nouns bound by the first noun phrase that's interfering between John and himself. So John directly C command and co-indexed with himself. It's the opposite of the second tree here, which is the grammatical one. So you see the noun phrase, under the noun phrase we have noun phrase John's and we have the second noun phrase father. So father here is preventing the binding to work, is interfering between himself and John's. So the C command is not working. Although himself co-indexed with the noun phrase John's, but in order for the binding to work, it has to be both the first noun phrase C commanding the second noun phrase, and they are bound. And it has to have both in order for the binding relation to work. So we move on to binding principles, and we have three principles here. So the first one is the anaphor distribution. And as we know, for the anaphor to be working and functional correctly in the sentence, it has to have another noun phrase in the sentence to get its meaning from. This sentence, himself saw John in the mirror, it's a grammatical sentence because the binding relation is not a symmetric relationship. It's one-way relation. That means the binder, John, has to C command the anaphor, the bindee, himself. It's not the other way. That's why this sentence is not grammatical. The second sentence, John's father saw himself, we have the anaphor here as co-indexed with John's, which is another noun phrase embedded inside the subject phrase here, which is not a grammatical sentence also, because for the index co-index, it has to be with the whole phrase, not with one noun phrase inside this whole structure here. The third sentence also is not grammatical because it has to do with binding domain. With the binding domain, it's the clause relationship. That means the anaphor himself, it has to be close and related to the noun phrase, the binder, in the same clause, not in separate clause. As you can see here, John said, it's one clause. That himself obsessed with football, it's another clause. So although the anaphor co-indexed with the binder John here, but they are bounded outside its binding domain. That's why the sentence is ungrammatical. The second principle is binding principle B. It has to do with the pronoun distribution, which is the opposite case of the anaphor. For the pronoun to be bound, it has to be bound outside its binding domain, as this sentence here. John said that he obsessed with football. As you can see, he co-indexed with John, and the sentence is grammatical because the pronoun is bound with the binder outside its binding domain. It's in a separate clause, in a different clause. And that's the opposite of this sentence here, why it's not grammatical. The second one, John saw him in the mirror, because the pronoun co-indexed with the binder, the noun phrase, in the same clause, which is incorrect and grammatical. The last sentence you can see, it's a grammatical also, because you know the pronoun can refer to someone else, not to the binder, the noun phrase inside this structure. The third and last principle here, binding principle C, it's about the R expressions distribution. As you can see, all these sentences are not grammatical because the R expression cannot be bound at all and must be free, because it makes sense. It refers to entities in the word. It makes its meaning from referring to object in the word. That's the end of my screencast. I'm sorry for rushing the last slides due to the time's sake. I hope you find this information useful and works as entry point to the chapter. Thank you for your time, and see you all in class.